The first thing I remember is the numbness. It felt like the world went underwater, like an invisible hand pressed gently against my ears until every sound became round and muffled. The refrigerator hum became a kind of low drone in the background, and I just stood there, 23 years old, staring at a photograph that suddenly felt like contraband. He was smiling in it. My father, the man who taught me how to ride a bike, who wiped my knees with the same rough, patient hands he used to sign permission slips. In the bottom corner, a date, June 19th. My name is Sasha Thompson, 23 years old, and I work late-night shifts in a blood analysis lab. I calibrate machines, track anomalies, verify identity markers for strangers I'll never meet. My voice probably sounds calm right now, but there is numbness underneath every syllable because I was sitting at my mother's dining table, and my entire life, every memory I trusted, was quietly dissolving into something I did not recognize. I used to believe that holding the pieces together was as close to safety as life offered. That night, safety felt like a memory. Before I continue my story, tell me this. Would you rather live with a lie that feels gentle or confront a truth that might destroy the only softness you've ever known? Share your honest opinion in the comments. I truly want to hear your perspective. I found the envelope by accident. A box marked "Simple Checks," shoved behind old tax records in the attic. No one prepared me for how betrayal does not always announce itself. Sometimes it arrives as quietly as handwriting on aging paper. These documents weren't loud. They weren't dramatic. They were almost painfully ordinary. And maybe that's what made them dangerous. When the realization spread, it didn't arrive like lightning. It was a slow chemical reaction. A thought here, a mismatch there, a question left unchecked for 23 years. I didn't gasp. I didn't cry. I didn't even curse. I just listened to the numbness forming under my ribs. Something chemical, something clinical. I handled the paper the same way I handle specimens at work. Controlled, measured, careful not to shake the container until I knew exactly what I was holding. That night, I ordered an at-home DNA kit using the same professional detachment I used to request reagents at the lab. But underneath it, there was a tremor I couldn't hide from myself. I recorded every moment into the voice memo app on my phone. Timestamps, observations, tiny fragments of emotion I didn't have the courage to speak out loud to another human being. The man in that photo, the man who raised me, who taught me how to balance on two wheels, who fed me toasted bread at 2 a.m., once carried me half a mile when my ankle gave out, who taught me how to tie my shoelaces. Suddenly, he was a variable, a placeholder, a father figure by function, not biology. My phone's microphone filled with the sound of me trying to name what had happened. And that numbness, it was only the beginning. Here at Revenge Home, we explore real psychological stories of betrayal and justice. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss our next emotional reckoning.
Before this revelation, before the numbness carved a quiet vacancy inside my chest, my life wasn't extraordinary. It was structured, simple, almost comfortably predictable. I worked evenings in the lab because I liked empty hallways. I liked the sound of centrifuges spinning like mechanical heartbeats. I liked work that didn't require personality, only precision. There's something soothing about seeing the world in data points, identity in quantitative units, truth in measurable form. I thought I understood what truth was. When my shift ended at 11 p.m., I would sometimes walk to the convenience store across the street to buy peppermint tea and oat cookies. The cashier, an older woman named Gloria, always said I moved like someone who doesn't want to be seen, but doesn't want to disappear either. I found that observation oddly accurate. My personality wasn't loud. It never needed to be. My mother always said, "The quiet ones live the longest." I used to think that was wisdom. Now I think it was foreshadowing. Our home was modest. 2 bedrooms, 1 hallway lined with framed pictures that documented childhood in curated increments. Commercial smile in kindergarten, award ceremony in 5th grade, graduation portrait under soft studio lighting. I didn't have siblings. My dad, the man I believed was my father, was gentle, rarely angry, always fair. When I scraped my knees as a child, he held me in the bathroom and wrapped gauze with the seriousness of a surgeon. He once told me that love was mostly logistics, showing up, bandaging wounds, remembering preferences, sharing silence without expecting filler words. That definition felt safe. Too safe. My mother, on the other hand, was warmth without softness, affectionate but guarded. She hugged me in short intervals, the way some people water plants. Functional, not emotional. She wasn't cruel. She wasn't cold. She was curated. She was composed in a way that suggested she did not want her luggage, emotional or otherwise, to spill open. I thought that was strength. Now I know it was concealment. Growing up, I adored both of them in different ways. Dad gave me gentleness. Mom gave me structure. Life did not feel fractured back then. I never questioned why certain medical forms were filled out with hesitation, why she kept old documents in boxes labeled vaguely, why certain relatives never visited. There were small inconsistencies, but childhood love has a way of converting oddities into charm. My mother worked from home, doing remote medical transcription. She typed fast, her fingers flying with a kind of muscle memory that suggested she lived half her life inside someone else's notes. I used to love the clicking of her keyboard. It reminded me of rainfall. Dad worked in a hardware store. He smelled like sawdust and pine whenever Sundays were quiet routines, pancakes, nature documentaries, grocery lists written in blue gel pen, Dad napping on the couch, Mom smoothing receipts into neat piles. My childhood memories were not broken, not abusive, not fractured, just ordinary. And maybe that's the tragedy. Betrayal doesn't always grow in the soil of chaos. Sometimes it grows in the garden of stability, watered by predictability. The knife is sharper when you never braced for impact. Sometimes I wonder if my mother ever looked at me and felt guilt simmer under her ribs. If she ever wanted to confess when Dad kissed the top of my head. If she ever almost told the truth when she watched us laughing together in the kitchen. Maybe she compartmentalized. Maybe she convinced herself biology wasn't the same as parenthood. Maybe she thought silence was protection. Maybe she thought I wouldn't survive the truth. I remember being 16 and noticing that Dad and I had different ear shapes. I remember asking if my slight lactose intolerance came from his side. He hesitated. I thought it was because he couldn't remember genetic details. What if the real reason was that he couldn't remember,
because none of those markers came from him. It's strange, the way memory rewrites itself in hindsight. Scenes that once felt pure now flicker with an amber tint, like old film stock exposing a flaw. Despite everything, I was content back then. My emotional equilibrium rested in simple routines: work, late tea, quiet dinners, the comfort of someone else's footsteps in the hallway. I didn't crave chaos. I didn't seek drama. I believed my world was transparent. The irony is poetic. My job was literally verifying DNA authenticity, but I never once questioned the authenticity of my own origin. This is why the betrayal hit me like anesthesia suddenly wearing off. Because my life was not constructed on trauma, it was constructed on trust. And trust, when shattered, leaves splinters that cut deeper than violence. The moment of betrayal wasn't a single explosion. It was layers. Thin, quiet, almost polite. I didn't confront my mother first. I confronted my own disbelief. It started with a letter, folded 3 times, tucked between 2 pages of an old medical booklet. The paper had a faint yellow tint, the kind that comes from age, not carelessness. It was dated 23 years ago. The signature at the bottom was not my father's. It was another man's name. Unfamiliar, short, almost sharp. There was a sentence in the middle that should have just felt administrative, but instead sounded like detonated glass in slow motion. It read, "Results confirm paternal match." I remember sitting on the floor in the attic, the dust in the air visible in the light beam coming from the single tiny window. I remember how it didn't make sense. How a sentence so small could hold that much force. I remember my ribs tightening the way they do when I accidentally inhale cold air too fast. My voice became a whisper, but numb. Not shocked yet, just suspended. Like I was witnessing a stranger's life. At work that evening, the centrifuge spun vials in small, perfect rotations. The machine made its soft, rhythmic whine. I looked at the digital display like I always did, except this time my mind was running that sentence in a loop instead of data. I kept telling myself there had to be an explanation. Maybe this was a procedural reference. Maybe this wasn't connected to me. Maybe this was part of my mother's job. I wanted to believe that. Numbness makes excuses sound logical. It was 3 nights later. That was the breaking point. My mother was in the kitchen, slicing cucumbers for dinner. Dad was watching a sports recap on his phone in the living room. Everything looked normal, felt normal, smelled normal. The quiet Latin spice mix she always sprinkled on chicken, the subtle citrus dish soap. But something inside me was about to mutate. And the precise moment, was so small it would look harmless from the outside. She set the knife down. She rinsed her hands. She wiped her palms on the white towel. And then she hummed. A soft tune. The same tune she hummed when she ironed my first school uniform 20 years ago. Somehow that was the trigger. The sound of her casual contentment. The ease. The unaffected normalness. The total absence of visible guilt. I looked at her and felt a quiet betrayal so sharp it was almost a medical sensation, like a needle sliding under the skin. I tried to speak, but the words stayed locked behind my teeth. In that moment, I realized she was not innocent in the way I always assigned innocence to her. She was not just a mother with secrets. She was a mother who made a decision 23 years ago, and she stuck to it. That night, I listened to the voice memos in my phone. My own voice sounded like someone performing emotional triage. My breathing was calculated, my articulation almost scientific, as if turning feelings into lab data made them easier to analyze. I replayed the earlier recordings again and again, hoping there'd be a moment where I would hear panic or sadness or some kind of collapse. Instead, what I heard was numbness evolving into steadiness. The steadiness itself felt like betrayal, not of her, but of myself, because I had always imagined I would crumble if something like this ever happened. I didn't crumble. I hardened. The betrayal moment, the real one, happened quietly in bed later that week. Dad had fallen asleep early. Mom knocked on my door and said goodnight, warmly, the same way she always did, completely unaware that her goodnight was now an emotional crime scene. When she walked away, her footsteps down the hallway sounded like a metronome marking time in a life she no longer controlled. As soon as her bedroom lamp switched off, that was when the numbness finally cracked open into something sharper. I realized this was not just a hidden past. This was a lie that had been actively maintained every single day of my life. Every school photo, every doctor visit, every "you have your father's smile." Every moment, she watched Dad father me, knowing he biologically wasn't. That's the betrayal. The choice wasn't a moment 23 years ago. The betrayal was the maintenance, the continuity. Every silence was an action, every omission a weapon. And the worst part, I still loved her. Painfully, deeply, It was the month of the first cold front. The air outside smelled metallic, like wet iron and asphalt. I remember noticing that before anything else. Before the number, before the name, before the collapse. The DNA kit email came at 3:14 p.m. I was at my station in the lab, logging sample anomalies. It was supposed to be a normal shift, a routine dataset, a routine day. The subject line was cold. 2 words. A digital blade. Result, ready. I felt my vertebrae go rigid. My hands suddenly felt like they didn't belong to me. My mind split into 2 planes, one that remained in the room with the centrifuge noise humming, and another that floated above my skull, weightless, hovering. Dissociation isn't cinematic, it's quiet. It's like someone pulls a plastic sheet between you and your own life. I clicked. I didn't inhale first. I didn't brace. My finger just moved on instinct. Number matches. 0%. My father, the man who held me when I had nightmares, was a medical non-match. My ribcage went hollow, empty, as if air had been pulled out of my bones. I stared at the number on the screen and I felt reality thin, like chalk scraped into dust. But then there was an additional field, a match suggestion, a name. Potential biological parent match, 99.98%. Alan H. Matterson. A man I had never met, a name that didn't belong to my household, a stranger. Why was it so specific? Why was he clearly identifiable? Why had no one ever said his name inside my childhood walls? Everything inside my skull detonated quietly. Not pain, but void. The kind of void that rewrites the edges of self. Who am I? Was my life a mislabeled file? Was I a clerical error with a pulse? I touched my own face and didn't feel like I was touching myself. I felt like I was touching someone whose origin story was misprinted. I walked to the bathroom and stared into the mirror. The fluorescent light was harsh, clinical. The name, Alan Matterson, felt artificial, like a prop, like a character. But he was real enough to appear in the database match. Did he know I existed? Did he ever wonder? Did he ever imagine my face? The betrayal mutated, evolved from personal to existential. My mother hadn't just lied about a detail. She had reauthored the literal origin of my body. She curated my genetics like a counterfeit artist. I stood in that unforgiving cold, just motionless, thinking, what kind of a parent would do that to their child? They claim to have so much. I wondered, was I so naive not to read the signs? My heart didn't break. It vacated. It removed itself from my body like a tenant leaving while the building was still burning. I suddenly didn't trust my own reflection. How many times had my mother looked at me, knowing that my DNA was a ghost, in her marital home? Did she ever feel sick holding me? Or did she simply compartmentalize? I walked home that night on autopilot. The streetlights smeared into vertical blurs through forming tears I wasn't willing to commit to. I didn't cry, not fully, but my eyes stung, the way screens sting after too many hours of pixel light. At home, I pulled out my parents' photo albums and scanned every page, every smile, every frame, every Christmas, every picnic, every school event. Now I wasn't looking at family history. I was looking at cinematography, scenes, performances. Did Dad know? Did he suspect? Or was he a victim too? Which betrayal was worse? The betrayal of silence or the betrayal of consent? The name Alan H. Matterson echoed in my skull like metal striking marble. Who was this man? Where was he when I took my first steps? Why was his genetic code inside my cells instead of the man who taught me how to whistle? I opened my notebook and wrote, in shaky handwriting, I don't know whose child I am. I stared at the sentence until it blurred into illegibility. Identity is the blueprint of personhood. And suddenly, my blueprint had redacted sections. I didn't sleep that night. I don't mean I slept badly or tossed around or half dreamed, half thought. I mean I did not close my eyes. My mind was an index of strategies, rooms, windows, angles,
access points, emotional tripwires, psychological mechanisms, all spinning. And I kept circling the same realization. If I walked into this confrontation raw, I would lose. Because people like my mother, pathological secret keepers, are always pre-armed. They already rehearsed their lies decades ago. They have a pre-built arsenal. They have pre-scripted justifications. They have a version ready to deploy. So I needed something she couldn't pre-anticipate. I needed to shift the frame. Not mother versus daughter. No. She is the fraud. She falsified paternity. She falsified identity. She committed medical deception against 2 men. There is no moral gray here. This is not a family argument. This is genetic fraud. And I decided to treat it that way. That shift emotionally is what saved my sanity. The first step of the plan was not revenge. It was stabilization. Because if I didn't stabilize myself, I couldn't execute anything. So I did 3 things immediately. First, I made a duplicate of the DNA result, encrypted, not cloud stored, physically stored. Then I researched legal definitions of paternal fraud in our jurisdiction. Then I built a psychological firewall, a commitment, that I would not confront her until I had the full chessboard. Because confrontation without leverage is just crying in front of a wolf. And make no mistake, my mother is capable of psychological predation. You cannot deceive on this scale unless you have a predator's brain at least in one compartment. The next piece was understanding the real father. Because revenge is not fire. Revenge is geometry. You cannot strike a target you haven't charted. So I used the surname, Matterson, and I began combing public employment listings first. Not social media, because professionals leave cleaner footprints. And the moment I saw a name that matched the age demographic and the birthplace region, it felt like my stomach inverted into ice. He was a retired professor. Biomedical ethics. Irony. Pure cruelty-laced irony. I spent 3 full evenings building a dossier. Every traceable timeline, every publication, every archived conference attendance, every recorded panel, and then cross-referenced the dates with my mother's employment history, conference appearances, travel receipts, the year she worked at the research center where he had guest lectured adjunct. It aligned. Their paths had crossed directly, not accidentally, not tangentially, direct overlap.
That was the moment where betrayal evolved again, mutated again, into something darker. She didn't just cheat. She didn't just lie. She curated a replacement father. And then she built an entire architecture of silence around it. So the question became, do I detonate this truth publicly, or do I engineer a surgical extraction? And I chose surgical. Because if I go nuclear, everything becomes noise, and she will perform victimhood, and other people will protect her narrative, because the pathetic always gets sympathy. But surgical? Surgical silence?
surgical exposure, that is irreversible. Phase 1 of the plan. Make contact with the biological father anonymously first. Not as daughter, not as emotional creature, but as data. A simple message. I believe we share a genetic connection. I have verifiable evidence. Would you be willing to confirm this confidentially? Because if he denies, or collapses, or panics, I needed to know his type. And if he accepts, then suddenly the board is different. Because now the silence is triangulated, not linear. Phase 2. Record my mother's natural lies before confronting her. Why? Because a liar's first version is the most unguarded. Once she knows I know, she'll craft a narrative. So I needed her recorded, talking about fatherhood, about my father, about family, all while still believing I'm ignorant. Not for internet, not for social media, for legal. Phase 3. Deliver confrontation not verbally, but evidentially. Because when you confront a liar with emotional words, they fight emotions. When you confront them with evidence, they fight silence. Silence is a harder battlefield for them. Phase 4. Give her a choice, not an out. Choice A. She confesses to my father privately, with me present, and we do it in controlled conditions. Choice B. She refuses, and then I give the evidence directly to my father, myself. And she loses narrative control permanently. This is not a threat. This is logistics. Revenge is not rage. Revenge is architecture. And then the final layer. The layer I haven't spoken yet. The layer I kept even from myself until the plan crystallized. I will not let her see me break. Because the real victory with these people is not the exposure, not the evidence, not the confession, not even the social fallout. The deepest victory is when they realize I did not collapse. They didn't destroy me. She planned a narrative of my identity my whole life. She assumed I would always be a character inside her script. And she assumed she controlled the pen. What she never expected was that I would become the editor. When she sees that, when she sees that I am calm, that I am precise, that I am collected, that I have paperwork, not tears, that I have timelines, not trembling, that I have documentation, not desperation, that is the moment she loses. Because her power never came from truth. It came from my ignorance. And ignorance is gone now. So the plan is not about screaming. It is not about emotional explosion. It is about removal. I will remove her authority. I will remove her monopoly on narrative. I will remove her ability to define reality. And then, only then, will I confront. Not as the daughter whose identity was stolen, but as the woman reclaiming authorship of her own origin.
The day I executed the plan, I felt a strange, surgical calm. The weeks of feverish thinking had been folded into precise steps. I made tea, packed the thumb drive hidden in an old necklace, and walked out with a steady gait. Small rituals to steady the body that had been hollowed out by shock.
First, Alan. The email I sent was clinical. I have verifiable evidence of a genetic match. Are you willing to confirm confidentially? He replied after 2 days. Meeting him in a public library cafe felt oddly formal. He was older than I'd imagined, thinner, with a professor's pause in his speech. He listened to the printouts without theatrics. His face moved through disbelief, sorrow, curiosity. He confirmed travel dates and a name he remembered my mother using. He did not ask for pity. He asked for space and proof, and I gave him both. Next, evidence. I had rehearsed this step more than any other. I planted a recorder behind a cookbook during a family dinner I framed as reconciliation. My hands were steady as I set plates, as if setting a scene in a play where I knew the lines. My mother moved through the ritual with her usual measured warmth. I asked neutral questions and let silences hang. She filled them the way she always did, until she said casually, "I always thought some things were better left unsaid." It landed like a physical blow. I didn't flinch in the moment. I let the recorder do the work my tears could not. Confrontation arrived the next week. I printed the DNA match, the email logs, Alan's notes, chain of custody forms. I placed them on the coffee table and sat. When she entered the room, she carried the same practiced composure she always had. "I know," I told her flatly. "I know about Alan. I have proof." She smoothed into a response I'd expected. She said, "It was complicated. I wanted to protect you." I let her speak until the cadence wound down. Then I played the recordings. The sound filled the room like evidence arriving by courier. Watching her register the evidence was not dramatic. She shifted from composure to small, visible fractures. The stories she'd rehearsed failed to plug the holes. She tried the protection narrative. I answered with a single word I had kept in reserve: consent. The word moved differently in the air than any accusation. It confronted action, not motive. She faltered, and finally admitted that fear had driven her choices. Fear of judgment, loss, the collapse of a life she had carefully built. Her admission was thin, but real. I recorded her confession not for revenge, but for permanence. Memory bends. Words outside of recollection are harder to dismiss. Dad woke up from the other room and sat there with the hollow look of someone who'd been removed from the plot of their own life. He needed time. He needed medical attention. Friends and relatives called, and the household folded into an awkward hush. My method was surgical because surgical keeps things real and necessary. I could have screamed the truth into social feeds, published timelines, weaponized humiliation for spectacle. I chose restraint. I brought evidence to the people who mattered: Dad, Alan, legal counsel. I offered my mother choices: confess openly with us present, or I would proceed with formal acknowledgement and legal steps. When given a choice, she chose to confess. Her voice cracked. It was human and inadequate and finally honest. The legal options were messy and bureaucratic. Amendment of records, potential claims, conversations with attorneys. None delivered instant emotional closure. But the mechanics mattered. They anchored truth into forms that could not be verbally erased. That anchoring felt like reclamation. After the confrontation, I did not stand on a stage of vindication. I returned to the lab. The centrifuge hummed its indifferent honesty. Machines returned results. They did not ask for a moral interpretation. My revenge was not vindictive. It was restorative. I had converted a lifelong deception into documented fact. I had given my father a truth he did not ask to carry,
and I had given myself the paperwork to rebuild. In the weeks that followed, the household learned to speak in a new grammar. Conversations were halting, then steadier. Some relatives sought to protect the old narrative, others distanced. Alan asked for time, then for gradual involvement. My mother began counseling and answered questions she'd long avoided. Dad moved from bewilderment toward cautious resilience. The point of the plan was never spectacle. Punishment is spectacle. Reclamation is quieter and harder. I stripped the lie of its theater and placed it under the sterile lights of documentation. Once there, it could be assessed, legislated against, and perhaps healed. Walking back into the lab that first Monday felt like returning to the only language that had not been rewritten. I calibrated equipment, logged controls, and listened to the centrifuge hum. The machines were patient. They required evidence, not drama. In that clinical attention, I found an odd comfort. My origin had been clarified on paper, and within that narrow procedural fact, I began to imagine a future that could be honest, even if it would never be the childhood I once trusted. The weeks after everything settled were quieter than I ever imagined they could be. Not peaceful at first, just quiet. That hollow quiet you get after a storm breaks open every window in your house, and then the weather just stops. The silence doesn't feel like mercy at first. It feels like debris. But gradually, the silence became oxygen.
When I look back now, the revenge wasn't the recorded confession or the documentation. The revenge was this: I did not let the lie rob me of the right to live. And maybe that was the point all along. Not punishment, reclamation. Now, when I stand in the lab and hear the machines cycling, I don't feel hollow anymore. I feel calibrated. I feel anchored. Truth is not the end of grief, but it is the beginning of recovery. And maybe someone watching this needs to hear me say this plainly. You do not have to stay broken just because someone else broke something inside you. You are allowed to rebuild in the daylight. You are allowed to trust again, slowly, carefully, honestly. And if my story proves anything, it's this: you can come back from betrayal and become stronger than the version of you they never expected to survive. My name is Sasha Thompson, and this was how I changed the narrative through carefully crafted revenge. Revenge is power.